and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. I thought what might be interesting just to kick off is to have a look at one of my favourite pairs of comedies from the early 1990s, which is the Addams Family and Addams Family Values. In particular, what I want to do is look at that first, the Addams Family film, which came out at Christmas in 1991. And this was at the end of a year where blockbuster movies had bumped around a little bit for Hollywood. That whilst Terminator 2 had hit big, whilst Robin Hood Prince of Thieves had hit big during the summer, there were loads of films that were coming out. I mean, stuff like Starlight and stuff like Backdraft and things like that. The way Hudson Hawk was that summer as well, where there was just a feeling that things had underperformed a little. Now, going into the Christmas of 1991, the big blockbuster hope was Steven Spielberg's Hook, and there was a real feeling from box office analysts in the build-up to that it would give the whole industry a shot in the commercial arm. Really, what they didn't know at the time is that Hook is ripe for an episode of this podcast in the future. Hook wouldn't quite perform as expected. In fact, it turned out to be one of the few films Steven Spielberg made that Steven Spielberg wasn't really a fan of himself. Again, that's a story for another time. But one of the films that did come through in Christmas 1991 was The Addams Family, the big screen adaptation of Charles Addams's comic strip. It was only a $30 million film, and it went on to gross nearly $200 million at cinemas worldwide, back at a point where that was still considered an awful lot of money. Now it would be small change, but back then that was a huge thing, especially as there were modest expectations on it. Now, perhaps there shouldn't have been. I mean, the cast of it was just delicious. Raul Julia, Angelica Houston leading the film, Christopher Lloyd in there as well. It would also give Christina Ricci her breakthrough role as Wednesday Addams, which is still, in my view, one of the best child acting comedy performances we've seen. But let's have a look. Let's just dig into the year or two before the Addams Family hit the big screen at some of the problems that it faced. So, if we dig back a little further then, the origins of the Addams Family movie actually came, we're at 20th Century Fox, in particular with producer Scott Rudin, who at the time was head of production at the studio, and he was a fan of Charles Addams's original cartoons rather than the TV series that had followed. And so it was Rudin who pitched the idea to Fox, and Fox was quite receptive to it. The problem first hit there that Fox didn't have the rights to the Addams Family property. It couldn't do anything with it. So whilst there was a residual interest in doing so, it just wasn't able to. The rights were actually with the legendary company, really, Orion Pictures. Orion, who in 1991 released The Silence of the Lambs. They also had Dances with Wolves around the same time, and would notably go into bankruptcy just a year or two after such huge films. That's a crucial point that we're going to come back to shortly. Now, Orion had picked up the rights to a library of properties from a company called Filmway, and part and parcel of those rights was to the Addams Family TV show. Now, Orion hadn't originally planned, to my understanding, to do anything with it. It just bought this package of rights, of which the Addams Family was with it. By the time it had it, Charles Addams had died, and there were critical rights also wrapped up in his estate that had been left to his second wife. So Fox was still enthused, it wasn't put off, but it tried to buy those rights and failed to do so. It just couldn't get going, because it turned out Orion did have a project in mind. It did want to do something with the Addams Family, but it wasn't a film. Instead, it was looking to see, it was gauging interest on getting a new TV show going. So thus Fox was dissuaded. Scott Rudin was still interested. The problem, though, is that the Addams Family wasn't a massively known property to people. The Munsters, if anything, was along the same lines, but the Munsters had a higher profile. It just seemed to get more TV repeats around the world. Certainly me in the UK, I didn't know the Addams Family until the film came along, but I knew the Munsters very well because they were regularly played on TV channels around here. So What happened though? The catalyst of things going, because the whole project just could have died a death there. But Charles Addams' ex-wife sold those remaining rights to Orion, and now Orion had the full package of rights that it needed. It decided to press ahead with the movie. Scott Rudin it recruited. He'd by this time left 20th Century Fox, and Rudin's built a reputation as one of Hollywood's most successful independent producers of film and theatre. But free of his Fox job, he could board the Addams Family, and a first draft of the script was thus put together. Now, it was penned by Larry Wilson, who'd done Beetlejuice, and Caroline Thompson, who's worked on several Tim Burton films. Edward Scissorhands was at the point the most notable. Also on scripting duties subsequently would come Paul Rudnick, and Paul Rudnick comes into the story a little bit later as well when we come to talk about the sequel. But that script, the script apparently took a lot of work. There were lots of rewrites, but I don't think that's a massively out of place story for a Hollywood production. Now, it came to the point where they had to recruit a director. Now, I mean, you've heard Beetlejuice and Edward Scissorhands mentioned so far, and unsurprisingly, therefore, Tim Burton was one of the people on the wish list, and he was strongly linked with the role, but eventually it didn't come to pass. Now, instead, interestingly, a director by the name of Barry Sonnenfeld got the nod. But Sonnenfeld wasn't a director per se at this point. He was a cinematographer, a very acclaimed one, had worked with the likes of the Coen brothers on, Miller's Crossing. It was shot by Sonnenfeld. He shot Big, he shot Misery, and his experience at framing shots, putting beautiful images on screen was there was no question about that at all. But for a directorial debut, it was a heck of a film to pick. Now, one of the things I really like doing is picking up old film magazines and reading the behind-the-scenes stories, and I collect an awful lot of them, because I think it was around the later 90s when film set coverage tended to get a lot more controlled and a lot more PR driven. But before that, there was a little bit more of a relaxed era, and writers were free to chart the highs and lows of a production with a little bit more freedom than perhaps they are now. That's not to say that there aren't stories that come out now. It's just it was a slightly less controlled era. This was only 20-30 years ago. But Sonnenfeld thus talked to Empire magazine back in 1991, and he was really, really candid about just what a tough job it was. In this interview, he talks about when the Coen brothers first hired him to shoot Blood Simple, and he just talks about how nervous he was that he threw up 17 times. But that level of tension, that level of stress would carry over into the Addams Family. And it was just 3 weeks into directing the film where, and I'm quoting Empire again here, Sonnenfeld in Empire here, where he says, "I was standing behind a chair when I started to feel this tremendous pressure in my chest, as if someone was blowing up a balloon inside me. Before I knew what was happening, I got very dizzy and tried to sit down, and wham, I'd passed out." And he'd fainted on the set 3 weeks into the production of this film. Now, you can imagine if that story came out now, that would be internet headlines all over the world. In the clickbait era, anything goes. There's no way that would be kept under wraps. But these stories were really coming out in earnest to the broader audience. After the film was in the can, it hadn't quite been released, but Sonnenfeld was quite candidly talking about it. And let's be clear, Sonnenfeld has gone on to have an excellent directorial career, the Addams Family films included. But he regained consciousness shortly after, apparently very upset. And Scott Rudin tried to get everyone home, but as Sonnenfeld recalled in this interview, he says, "I remember begging Scott, please let me get up and get going again. If we have to stop every time I faint or start to cry, we'll never get that movie done. This movie done." And so, whereas Rudin had planned to give everyone a half day off just to give Sonnenfeld the space to recover, Sonnenfeld was absolutely adamant he was going to carry on. But this was clearly a taxing shoot, and it was a shoot that went on for 20 weeks. If you think about the sets in that Addams Family film, the sheer detail of them, there's nothing obviously digital in there. It's a whole different era. It had to be built, it had to be shot. Think of the scene where Fester and Gomez just basically go down a massive slide. You couldn't fake that. So the production was ongoing, but more problems continued to hit in that 20-week time. And again, with 3 months still of shooting left to go, the director of photography on the film, a guy called Owen Roisman, I hope I pronounced that correctly, well, he left and went on to take another film on, and there were still months to go. He still got final credit, but in came Gail Tattersall, and she came in to shoot and finish the film. But within weeks of her taking on, the whole film had to stop again because she was rushed to hospital. So we've lost 2 DPs in the midst of this, and Tattersall wouldn't be there for the completion of the film. And as it happened, what happened consequently, Sonnenfeld, who you remember we talked about, had this extensive CV as a cinematographer himself. He had no option. He had to take on those duties himself. So already we had a director heavily under stress, on his debut feature where he'd fainted weeks into it. But now he was also the cinematographer on it as well. So it was all closing in. A further thing, I mean, it just would be an anomaly on another film, but the brilliant Raul Julia, he had to miss filming for several days when a blood vessel burst in his eye. And incredibly, there was still more to come. Because, I mean, notwithstanding also that Barry Sonnenfeld's wife was ill at one point during shooting, and he had to go home and visit her all the while production was ongoing. However, it was away from the film set that perhaps the biggest threat to the Addams family was gathering storm. Now let's go back to talking about Orion. Orion, if you remember, I mean, they'd done RoboCop, they'd done The Silence of the Lambs, they'd done Dances with Wolves. You know, these were all modestly priced films that returned very significant profits. However, Orion was putting money on, let's just say, less successful ventures as well, and it was getting strapped for cash. And the problem with the Addams family was the Addams family, with all these problems going on and all these challenges going on during production, was seeing its own budget balloon. Again, these are modest numbers in terms of modern cinema, but the Addams Family was originally budgeted at $25 million. It came in at $5 million over. You know, that's a fifth extra on top from a company that was already struggling to pay the first bill. Now, the reason for the extra cost was also new material that was added to the script once cameras had started rolling. So there was that to throw in as well. But the simple fact at the heart of it was Orion could no longer afford the film. It desperately needed money. And so, unbeknownst to the cast and crew, while the film was shooting, Orion was in negotiations with Paramount Pictures to sell the entire movie, to move it to an entirely different studio whilst filming was going on. And so one day Scott Rudin was having a conversation with one studio. The day after, he had another on the phone trying to get up to speed on just what was happening with the production. So Paramount, as it turned out, would pick up an absolute bargain. And as such, it would be Paramount's logo on the front of the film. It would be Paramount that got the receiving end of the huge profits that the film made. All the while, Orion was pinning its hopes on RoboCop 2 to try and give it the necessary huge injection of cash. And RoboCop 2, well, there's another story and a half. But the Addams Family finally made it to the screen in November 1991. The critical response was good, but the audience response was great. And Paramount had a huge hit on its hands. There were still residual problems. I mean, it's if you thought it was chaos beforehand, there's a thing with the home DVD rights, the home video rights, which has accounted for the fact that it's only recently you've actually been able in the UK to pick up the Addams Family films on any kind of half-decent release. Because when Paramount bought the project from Orion, it turned out what that deal didn't include was the full foreign distribution rights to the film. Now, those distribution rights aren't held by Paramount, they're held by MGM. Just to confuse it a bit more, MGM titles in some territories, including the UK, are distributed by Fox. So the bottom line is, when it came to the DVD release of the film, outside of just a couple of territories, most countries did not get a release of the film on DVD. They got video, but on DVD until 2013. over a decade after the film made it into cinemas. There was also a lawsuit, as many of these films tend to attract once they're successful, with someone saying that various trademark things were used and shouldn't have been done. But in the scheme of everything else, it just sounds a little bit minor. Now, Paul Rudnick, if you remember his name, but he came in and did some extra work on the screenplay of the film. Rudnick would subsequently, in the aftermath of the film's success, be hired to write the script for what would turn into Addams Family Values. And just a small aside on that, and perhaps we'll save Addams Family Values for a future episode, but a small aside on Addams Family Values, the title of it, in case you didn't know, it's a fairly well-known story, was inspired by the then Vice President of the United States, Dan Quayle, with his infamous family values speech, and so the entire name of an Addams Family film is reportedly due down to that. The Addams Family journey wasn't completely done. There was still, even though Addams Family Values wasn't a massive success, there was still talk and hopes for doing an Addams Family 3. Those hopes disappeared tragically when Raul Julia died in October 1994 at the age of just 54 years old. Which made really the idea of a further film amongst the midst of the tragedy, the idea of a further film, a bit of an impossibility. However, one still happened anyway, because there was talk about getting a new television project going with Warner Brothers. It was looking to do the new Addams Family, and one of the things that came of that was it put together a TV movie which is called Addams Family Reunion. You may know this. And Addams Family Reunion does have one crossover with the Addams Family and Addams Family Values films, in that Carol Strucken, I hope again I've pronounced his name right, would reprise the role of Lurch. Christopher Hart would again provide his hand to Thing. But the whole rest of the film, just a year or two after, was just recast, and this is where Tim Curry, for instance, came in to play Gomez, and Daryl Hannah was in to play Morticia, and it would be fair to say this was a very, very low rent production. The subsequent Addams Family TV show did get greenlit off the back of it. It ran for a couple of seasons, but Addams Family Reunion has rightly really become a very tricky film to get hold of. It did get a video release as a Warner Brothers, again a different distributor involved, a Warner Brothers premiere release in the UK, but oddly that Criterion Collection DVD release of it is just not going to happen. That then has been the first episode of Film Stories. What I would hugely appreciate is if you have enjoyed this, because this is a whole new thing for me, if you have enjoyed this, if you could leave a review, if you could tell your friends, if you could just spread the word. I personally love stories like this, and I love telling stories like this and hearing stories like this, and if I can get to the point of this podcast being a home where it doesn't have to be a classic movie, it doesn't have to be a revered movie, it can just be a fun movie, the kind that we don't often hear the behind the scenes stories are. If this podcast can be a home for that, that is my ultimate aim of it. I'll need your help to get there. Thanks very much for listening. Take care, and if all goes to plan, I'll see you next time.